Disgurba a cháirstein, agus mór an tainke jara sunna bhí códaring in noch uásach mar feicin, agus fáilt ar a bhula chun chiadtachtas againn ans in Ionad Sàr-mhathais son Teagasg, ha nach chleachdadh againn fáilte chus ar a bhula in noch, agus seo chiadtachtas an den stríocht de heiseanan agus againn stíte Fhrìomh Gàidhlig. Hanna urrainn géin fáilte a chud an nollamh Diane Tedick in noch, ha códaring son ringling mai géin le tífid gáin ha againn Tuigse èisteachd Sgafallachd Tuigse Sgafallachd an den son teich horst gan Mhion-chànan an den Phrìomh Fo-Ionad. Bei teacher an den filmdaghanach ba an Ionad Tedick an seisean, agus hai cúteach bhín sát an na film teacherin son grún blianachin. Agus bhí Phrìomh eòlach orra transcribal tronjór scribi códarí ro-innleachdan agus sin chleachdadh tríocht le cúslichan againn an tulbór agus ha sin cúteach a chleachdadh an den gimseach professianta an le cúte de Scotland. Agus sé leor lé email a han géin an le Phrìomh Fo-Ionad agus ha chleachdadh géin an de bhios practice agus an de bhí tortaich de cànain an scodaran. Dus a bican fistiki acn di hortgeid Mhion-chànan noch, ha sin go bhí gapárach agus could sin jugah in clárach an pústaí, ha sin dóchas na hechtin a na hechtin. Agus hanner er pein ma hasú son an camera acu chumal éid no ma hasú son chudé de is di pein. Bhí chom an chéistin a chuúd ar an Ionad Tedick tron Diane agus híisiú chus go háist gil Q&A an son híisteachú chud an áist agus híisiú go chéistin I go ddíireadh. Agus in bud me géireadh na gawas an céal acu tron Diane na gabhútrug bud trítínisteí le bhí bruchuig ar an nuchéal chuúdsú as a fústaí. Now, it's a delight for me to welcome Professor Tedick, who's with us tonight, and we're very grateful for the time that she's giving us tonight, and very much looking forward to her session. And I've shared with the group, Professor Tedick, that we're collecting questions. If anybody has a question, just pop it up in the Q&A. And we'll come to those at the end. And as I mentioned, you can keep your cameras on or off, and the session will be recorded, and recording will be sent out hopefully at the start of next week. And if your connection goes at all during the session, just come in using the same connection that you came in initially into the meeting. Gleda. And Professor Tedick, are you happy to share your slides?
I am, yes. Thank you very much. Yes.
Many thanks indeed.
Great. So, yes, before I begin, I'd like to thank and Thurko for inviting my colleague Roy Lister and me to offer these presentations. I had the distinct pleasure of visiting Scotland in 2018 and working with Gaelic medium teachers, so I'm really delighted to be connecting with the Gaelic teaching community again. Thanks to all of you for attending the presentation today, and I hope you'll be able to attend Roy's presentation in October, as these two sessions are really intended to work in tandem. Okay, here is a brief overview of what I'll be talking about today. I'll begin with a brief review of the language outcomes of immersion programs. And for this presentation, I'll mostly be using the term immersion to refer in general to programs like Gaelic medium education, where a minority language is used to teach the regular school curriculum. And then I'll offer a rationale for prioritizing minority language use in immersion classrooms. Next, I'll define scaffolding and quickly introduce various types of scaffolds. And finally, I'll share some examples of different types of scaffolds with an emphasis on scaffolding comprehension. Okay, let me take a few moments to offer a rationale. So there's been a great deal of research on the language outcomes of immersion students, particularly in Canada and the US. And when it comes to English language development, immersion students' English is as good as or better than the English of students who attend English-only programs. So there's no detriment to the development of English. When it comes to the development of the minority language, we know that immersion students attain higher levels of proficiency than students who study the language as a subject. We know that they develop good comprehension skills and functional levels of communicative ability in the minority language. In other words, they can make themselves understood quite well. And yet, studies on language acquisition in immersion programs have shown that students' proficiency in the minority language is underdeveloped. They achieve lower than expected production skills. Their grammatical accuracy and complexity lags, and they tend not to have a very broad vocabulary. Their language also lacks sociolinguistic appropriateness, and we also know that their minority language production becomes more anglicized over time. In other words, even though they might be using Spanish words, the construction is very English-like in their speech. And these lower than expected language outcomes appear to correlate with students' increased use of English as they advance in grade. Additionally, a plateau effect occurs as more English is introduced to the curriculum. This means that their proficiency in the minority language levels out and doesn't get much better once they reach a certain level, which is often in the intermediate range around B1 on the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, or the CEFR. When it comes to research done in Scotland on Gaelic medium student language outcomes, what we know about English development is that GME students' attainment on tests of literacy and other school subjects at the end of primary school is on par with that of their peers who learn only through the medium of English. As for their minority language development, it's assumed that GME students' Gaelic is more advanced than that of students studying Gaelic only as a subject, but it's not native-like. And the Gaelic outcomes are assumed because no direct comparisons between these two groups have been made, although there may be more recent studies that I'm not familiar with. This comes from a review that I did with Joanna McPake that was published in 2022, so there may be more recent research that I'm not on top of. Another study revealed some non-Gaelic vocabulary and grammatical constructions among GME students, as well as pronunciation showing signs of English influence. And similar to what has been found in the US and Canada, there appears to be a plateau effect by those early secondary years, and this may be due to fewer opportunities to study through the medium Gaelic at the secondary level. So, given these language outcomes, is it okay to use English during instructional time in the minority language? Interestingly, even though the studies have shown that immersion students use more English as they advance in grade, even during instructional time in the minority language, the use of English has been encouraged by some scholars, such as Jim Cummins, Meryl Swain, and Sharon Lapkin. And it's been encouraged as a cognitive support, specifically to support content learning and to generate more complex ideas. And this really, their recommendations come from research that's been done with language minority students. In other words, students in the US who don't speak English at home. What studies have shown is when they're allowed to use their native language to help comprehend some information and perhaps write a draft in their native language and then transfer that to English. Some studies have shown some positive outcomes, but we don't have those studies when it comes to kids who speak English in the home, these majority language students. So it seems like a bit of a stretch to make the same recommendation for a completely different context and group of learners. And we really don't have any research that identifies any benefits of using English in immersion programs to justify using even more English. There's no research evidence to show that English promotes acquisition of the minority language. And moreover, English is a high status language, so it's difficult to develop and get students to use other languages. Therefore, guidelines for language use and immersion in GME programs need to favor the minority language. In addition, we really need to consider the socio-political context of school settings to understand whether students are using English as a cognitive support for processing content, or if English is simply a manifestation of a societal language imbalance that favors English use. English can facilitate comprehension, but processing content through the minority language rather than English is more likely to benefit minority language development because of the depth of processing that's required. So depth of processing involves the extent to which a learner reflects on new information and links it to other relevant information. It's about relating information to their existing knowledge, understanding meaning of that new information, and making connections to other concepts. We need to be able to remember information in order to learn. That's how we learn, we remember. And memory recall depends on the depth to which information is processed. Deeper, more meaningful processing leads to stronger, longer lasting memories than shallow, superficial processing. Hence, if immersion teachers use English to support comprehension, deep levels of processing will occur in English, and shallow levels will occur in the minority language. This may facilitate comprehension, but the end result is that English will be more readily accessible, readily available than the minority language, and students will end up being more motivated to use English rather than Gaelic, for example. And the stakes are incredibly high. This is especially problematic for a context such as yours. I think that we can agree that the stakes for GME are higher than in programs where the second language is widely spoken around the world, such as Spanish, French, or Chinese. These languages will continue to flourish regardless of levels of competence achieved by immersion students, as there are millions of native speakers and many other learners in other forms of educational provision. But in Scotland, Gaelic is a minority language that is endangered. And we know that there is relatively weak, or in fact, in some areas, non-existent intergenerational transmission of Gaelic. So it's highly problematic when we can't count on generations passing on the language to younger generations. So this means that GME is really a key language revitalization strategy. And if GME fails to produce new generations of proficient speakers of Gaelic, the language will be closer to extinction. So the stakes are very high indeed. And I think that Gaelic immersion teachers, just like Irish immersion teachers and immersion teachers in our Indigenous languages here in the US and in Canada, it's not just about what happens in your classroom, it's about what you do and how that impacts the rest of the Gaelic community and the Gaelic speaking community. Because if you're committed to making sure that Gaelic is not lost, it's going to be really important for you to be a part of that push and make sure that you're prioritizing Gaelic in your teaching. So all we have to do is prioritize Gaelic use. Oral interaction is the key source of L2 learning, and immersion programs provide many rich opportunities for oral interaction about subject matter. So all we have to do is use Gaelic, right? It's easy peasy. Well, as it happens, it might be a bit challenging because there's an inherent dilemma underlying immersion and GME programs. Namely, improving students' proficiency requires students' extended use of the target language, whereas extended use requires higher levels of proficiency. So it's a bit of a paradox, right? In other words, how can students fully participate in immersion classrooms in a language that they're still learning and know only partially? Well, the answer lies in the scaffolding that teachers provide to enhance oral classroom discourse so that it becomes a key source of learning. And teachers can scaffold oral interaction by making input comprehensible, asking the right kinds of questions, pushing students' language use with prompts and routines, and using a range of feedback types, among other ways to scaffold. So I'm going to be focusing in this presentation on scaffolding comprehension, and then Roy will follow up on October 29th to talk about scaffolding production. So immersion teachers have many scaffolding strategies at their disposal to enable students to process subject matter through the minority language without using much, if any, English. And if instruction is scaffolded in ways that help students process complex subject matter through that minority language, the deeper levels of processing will help to push their minority language development forward. So this is important, and I want to emphasize again, the depth of processing required for learners to engage with subject matter taught through the immersion language is believed to move language development forward. And that's precisely what we need in our immersion program so that students are more confident in using the minority language because it's more readily accessible to them. Okay, let me move on now to defining scaffolding and to explaining various types of scaffolds. I've already mentioned scaffolding rather vaguely, so let me define it clearly. Scaffolding refers to different types of support and assistance provided by teachers to help students understand and engage with content at levels higher than they'd be able to reach on their own. It's often talked about as being a temporary support, much like a temporary scaffold that's used to support a building that's undergoing renovation. But in bilingual classrooms, scaffolding should be used from the beginning of the program through to the end, as it's a key instructional strategy that makes these programs possible. As students advance in grades, scaffolding continues to be critical because the content becomes much more demanding, both cognitively and linguistically. What changes is the nature of this scaffolding as students acquire language and become more adept at producing and comprehending that second language independently. So we want to see a balanced use of scaffolding. Scaffolding is essential at early stages of language acquisition and at the start of a new lesson or unit where content concepts and the language used to articulate those concepts are new to students. However, as students gain language skills and become more familiar with the content, it's equally important to shift the pedagogical emphasis to more language-dependent tasks and techniques. This process is like the ebb and flow of ocean tides. When a teacher's introducing new concepts and new language, that tide comes in with heavy scaffolding, and throughout the unit, as students gain more independence and are able to handle more language on their own, teacher scaffolding eases, just like you see these cute little birds running from the, as little scaffolds, if you will. It's important to know that, you know, by the time the kids are in grade 4 and grade 5, they should have a lot more language. So if we see teachers using the same kinds of scaffolding strategies that they're using before grade 1 in those higher grades, that's a problem. So we need to really shift how we scaffold when we're working with students that have more language. So we use scaffolds to support both comprehension and production. Comprehension scaffolds assist students in understanding content presented through the minority language, and production scaffolds support students in productively using that language to engage with the content. In the hurly-burly of actual classroom discourse, there's a dynamic relationship between strategies for scaffolding comprehension and those for scaffolding production, as you'll see in a number of the examples that I'll be sharing. I also want to point out that there are 3 broad types of scaffolds that were categorized initially by Echevarria, Vogt, and Short. Verbal scaffolding involves how teachers use language to support students' comprehension and language use. Procedural scaffolding refers to the kinds of classroom procedures like activity frames and routines that teachers use to support students' comprehension and language use. And instructional scaffolding refers to how teachers use print and multimedia resources and other tangible tools to support learning. I should point out that it's often the case that 2 or all 3 of these types are working together simultaneously during classroom instruction. But for the sake of clarity, I've separated them here in this presentation so that the characteristics of each type are understood. Employing scaffolding strategies for comprehension in this way reduces the need to resort to using English to facilitate comprehension. This is important because use of English for explanatory purposes decreases the student's need and motivation to process content through the minority language and thus reduces their cognitive engagement with that language. So in addition to the 3 broad categories of scaffolds, there are different ways that scaffolding manifests in classrooms. Teachers can engage in reactive approaches or in the moment scaffolding techniques such as questions and feedback and so on to ensure that oral interaction in the classroom is a key source of learning. And teachers can also take time to scaffold proactively by pre-planning activities to promote metalinguistic awareness and create opportunities for practice in meaningful contexts. Now we can see how all of these come together and how they interact. So scaffolding for comprehension, of course, involves all 3 types, verbal, procedural, and instructional. And each of those have proactive and reactive approaches, although we see that with verbal scaffolding, it's more reactive in nature, whereas with procedural and instructional, it's more proactive in nature because there's more planning involved on the part of the teacher. Okay, now I'm going to transition. I've explained these various types of scaffolds, so I'm going to transition to providing some examples. And I'm going to share examples that correspond to those 3 main types. So let me start with verbal scaffolding. As I've mentioned, this entails linguistic redundancy, whereby teachers express more or less the same message, but in different ways. And teachers do this by using paraverbals, or changing their intonation, their rate of speech, using pauses and wait time to allow students to process the language. And verbal scaffolds involve self-repetition through paraphrasing, use of synonyms and cognates, sharing many examples, and clear sequencing words and connectors to cue students and facilitate comprehension. In addition, verbal scaffolding is supported with nonverbal examples like gestures and facial expressions and pantomime, and these are also used by teachers to make sure students can understand them. Okay, so it's kind of difficult to show a lot of examples of verbal scaffolding without showing a video of a teacher engaging in that, and I have to thank Roy for letting me use this slide and video to illustrate verbal scaffolding. So in a grade, this was in a grade 1 and 2 classroom, and the teacher was reading from the Magic Treehouse book series about traveling in a Viking ship. This video was recorded in a French immersion school in the Montreal area that enrolled a combination of students who spoke English at home and students who spoke French at home. So the teacher was reading in English, but makes frequent stops to ensure that all students, including those French-speaking students, or especially those French-speaking students, were understanding the vocabulary and the story content. And as you watch this, please pay attention to how she adjusts her language and uses gestures and facial expressions, as well as other strategies to ensure comprehension of the story, such as modeling and having the children act out parts of the story themselves.
So the cows were up there. Make believe you're a cow. Okay, so you're grazing, so you're eating some of the grass. Thanks, cow. Okay, excellent. Nice. With a kind face. Okay, boys, look kind and handsome. Look towards the girls. Kind weaving in French. Weaving. You know?
No.
No, that's the word I want. Weaving, yes. Okay, le trois switch. Tisser. Tisser. Tis. Boing. Boing. The gates close. The bridge comes up, and the city is sealed, for they all had curved roofs. See the roof? It goes, make like that. It goes like that. It's like a slide of sorts. Wires that were lined up at a stall filled with tiny cages. Make believe you're in a tiny cage. Oh, no picture here, so use your imagination here. What's for sale there, said Annie. Crickets. Make believe you're a tiny cricket in a cage. Thank you. Gasp. Gasp. Okay, so that means something's happening. The Dragon King was glaring at them. Let's just take a quick look, said Annie. Maybe it's the way out of here. Jack took a deep breath. Take a deep breath. You know when you're trying to calm yourself down? I didn't say hold your breath. You take a deep breath. Okay, calm myself down. Calm myself down. Bottom. Jack blinked. You blinked. Let's see. You people are kids, as you know. So let's just sit. Two people here. Okay, just sit. 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 Okay, two people in back. Okay, you two people. Okay, you two people sitting back. Okay, you two going back. Okay, you and you sitting back. Hurry up, go, go, go. Okay, everybody else sitting back. Okay, everybody else come here and you're sitting back. Choo, 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 choo. Okay, let's move you over a bit to make sure you're fine. Okay, good. Okay, sit up, please. Sorry, okay, sit. Okay, row your boat. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. Now, they would use their two hands, okay? You guys are the left side, obviously. You guys are the right side. Now, let's count how many people we have here. Let's count by two. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. We have 17, but they would be 32 and really big men. So how far back do you think it would go? Past the classroom. So this was a really, really big ship. I mean, this is like, you're just going to turn around, open the box that's underneath your behind, and look inside the box. Ah, okay, don't talk. Listen to what she found. She lifted out 2 small Viking helmets. Maybe these were made for Viking kids who sometimes ride in the ship, said Annie. Maybe, said Jack. So put your helmets on. So see, you're just like them. The wind picked up as Jack lifted his heavy oar over the side of the ship. He lowered it into the water, but the current was so strong that the oar was ripped from his hands. So all the boys, you make believe you're rowing, and then you just lose it. It's pulled away from you by the wind and the sun. So you don't have it anymore. You don't have your held to the side of the ship and pulled himself up. Another huge wave was coming right towards them. It's our darkest hour now, cried Annie. Chad, you're too funny for it. Okay, you stand there. He's very good at reacting, so you just stand next to me. Okay, and as I read, you just do what you're doing. It's our darkest hour now, cried Annie. Get Brother Michael's book. Jack reached into his leather bag. He pulled out the jeweled book and held it up. Save us, story, he cried. He looked at the sea again. What he saw made him scream. Rising from the oncoming wave was a giant sea serpent.
I just love how how at the end there she pulls this student up to act out what she's reading, which serves as a great scaffold for kids, right? And also sort of keeps this squirrely kid from just making things difficult by sitting on the floor. I thought that was a brilliant classroom management move. So I hope you noticed the gestures, the facial expressions, how she changed her intonation, the way that she had kids acting things out. All of these are verbal scaffolds to help kids understand, right? Okay, so we're going to be moving on now then to the next type of scaffolding, procedural scaffolding. And to reiterate, this refers to activity frames and routines that teachers use to ensure predictability and hence facilitate comprehension. And these can be in the form of predictable routines, various strategies to activate and build background knowledge, modeling, demonstrations, frequent comprehension checks, and also breaking down complex information or processes into their component parts. So let me show you some examples here. It's very typical in the early grades to establish classroom routines to build familiarity. Often teachers share a daily schedule of activities, use strategies from responsive classrooms, such as having a morning meeting or displaying a morning message. There are calendar time routines and also sometimes the use of songs to signal and guide transitions to new activities. A very common routine that's used in classrooms to check comprehension and elicit student responses is think, pair, share. And I like to encourage teachers to vary the share part so that students have to use first person sometimes and third person sometimes, or even first person plural. Now that's not difficult in English, except for the third person singular, right? That shifts in English, but the other persons stay the same. Whereas in Spanish, they all change. So that can be really tricky for kids. And I don't know how it works in Gaelic, but perhaps that's an issue in Gaelic as well. Another strategy that can be used is guided practice, whereby responsibility is gradually released from the teacher to students with this I do, we do, you do modeling frame. And so you can see that it starts with the teacher modeling whatever needs to happen in the activity. Then the teacher does it with students to check that they're understanding, and then students can do that individually. And then there's an extra step that could be added. You do it together, where the teacher might have small groups or pairs of students do something before students move to working individually. I should mention that you will get a copy of this PowerPoint. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. Sorry about that. Okay, learning centers are yet another way to establish familiar routines and get students working individually or in pairs or small groups on tasks. A lot of learning centers are designed to elicit student language production, but here are a few examples of centers that emphasize comprehension. A center could have audiobooks with headphones for listening, followed by activities such as sequencing sentence strips or pictures in the correct order to summarize a story, or you could complete a graphic organizer to summarize main ideas and details, for example. You might also find a sentence building station with a pocket chart with words for parts of speech, different parts of speech that students need to use to create sentences. And of course, this center activity requires both comprehension and production, as did the one before. And another center might involve independent or partner reading with follow-up activities. And here's where thoughtful pairing of students can be key to ensuring success with the activity. Also, a key type of procedural scaffold is activating and building prior knowledge, building background knowledge, right? And there are many different ways to do this. One way is by offering up provocation tables before the start of a unit. So imagine you have a unit on the life cycle of the butterfly. You might set up tables such as these to allow students to observe, interact with, read or view items that you have at the table for several days before the unit begins. And all the while the teacher observes and listens to students to be able to document what students already know about the topic. And the unit begins with tapping into what students already know, what they've learned from the provocation tables, what they already knew coming in as well. And another strategy is that familiar KWL chart, where students identify what they already know about a topic, and then what they want to know, and finally they return to the graphic organizer to fill in what they learned. And you might do that throughout the course of the unit and keep adding to what they've learned over time, or you could do the whole thing at the end. Note how this is a graphic organizer that's an example of instruction, which is an example of instructional scaffolding. So we can see here how all three kinds of scaffolds are working together, right? You've got verbal scaffolding as the teacher is interacting with students and getting them to produce things. You've got this important routine of building background knowledge that's procedural, and you've got the use of a graphic organizer, which is instructional. Another type of KWL graphic organizer includes a P's. So you have the W for what I know, what I know, you have the K, then you have the W for want to know, then you have a column that's P. What do I predict about this? And then finally, what did I learn? Another way to scaffold comprehension is to break down information into component parts. So let's imagine here that grade 1 students are being read Tadpole's Search for Mom. This is where they're interacting with lots of different animals to determine which of those animals is the mom. And there are multiple characters in this story, and at some point the teacher guides the students on identifying descriptors for each of those characters, because those descriptors are quite important for comprehending this story. So you can see here that they fill in a graphic organizer, breaking down that information into component parts to make it more comprehensible to learners. And again, we're using a graphic organizer, so tapping into instructional scaffolding as well. Another example of breaking down information so it can be better comprehended relates to chunking text into smaller portions. So when you're working, especially with older students, you can be dealing with longer texts, and students can often benefit from periodic pauses to check for understanding, and this allows students time to process information. You can do this by using sticky notes, these post-it notes that are placed strategically at points in the text where they should stop, or you can simply write on the text itself if you're working with photocopies or even digital texts that allow you to use tools to write on that text. And again, this is all about reminders to pause to check understanding. Another way to scaffold comprehension of longer texts is to break them into smaller, more manageable sections. And another strategy for doing that is using file folders that you cut into sections as a way to keep students focused on a particular paragraph. This can be really great for kids who suffer from, who I shouldn't say suffer, but who have ADHD, and it can be difficult for them to have a whole page of text. It's difficult for them to focus. So that's a good strategy for that as well. And another way to scaffold comprehension, another classroom activity, and I should say this is a classroom activity that's actually all about combining both comprehension and production. It requires comprehension because you can't remember and write down language that you haven't understood, and it also involves production. But this is called, you can turn this into a classroom routine if it's done on a regular basis, say weekly. And this is to have students do a dictogloss. And a dictogloss involves joint reconstruction of a text that's been read aloud. It's another example, as I was saying earlier, of how comprehension and production come together in instruction. So first, students should already have some knowledge about the topic of the text. And this could be from a textbook or an article or website, or might even be something that the teacher has written. And in fact, if there's a particular grammatical form that you're wanting to bring students' attention to, and that's something that Roy is going to be talking about more so in October, the text could have multiple examples of this form so that you have students listening for it and also having to produce it. So here are the steps of the process. The teacher reads the text aloud at a normal speed and just has the students listen. Then the teacher reads it again. Students listen again. And these are not long texts. You can even do this with young children with just a sentence. With older children, it can be about a paragraph. These are not long texts at all. And then the teacher reads the text aloud a third time. And this time, students are writing down as much of the key points and key phrases as they can recall. You have to reassure students that they don't need to recall everything. They don't have to write everything down. Just fragments and words are fine. It should just take a few minutes. And then in pairs, you can have the students work together to compare the notes they took and then try to co-construct a more complete version of the text. And then you can get two pairs together. So pairs squared, and then students collaboratively improve the text and create a new version focusing on the same overall meaning with accurate word use, grammar, and spelling. And then as students are working on their final version, you're encouraging them to check whatever is important in terms of the way that the grammar of Gaelic works. So in Spanish, subject-verb agreement, gender number agreement are really critical. Having them check spelling of technical words and other words. And then you display the original text in some way up on the screen. And then as a whole group, you debrief this whole process. You discuss similarities and differences between what was read by the teacher and what was reconstructed by the students. You focus on nuances and meaning for any alternative words and phrases used. The goal isn't for students to produce a text that's identical to the original, but one that has the same information and is appropriately worded. And again, this is something that should be done not just like a one-off, because it's a process that requires some practice. And so if you did this on a more regular basis and made it more of a routine, this is a way to really build both comprehension and production. Another thing that's really critical for procedural scaffolding is making sure that you are checking comprehension along the way. There are frequent comprehension checks. There are lots of ways to do this. I'm going to just briefly talk about a few. So just in July, I was recently doing some work at an English immersion school in Japan, and I saw a teacher who, by the way, was from Scotland. He and his wife were there teaching. And I saw him use this routine. He had his 4th grade students, after a little lesson on electrical circuits, he had these students put their heads down, and then he said red light. And he had those students who felt that they needed help from the teacher would raise their hands. Then he had them put their hands down, and then he said yellow light. And those students who felt that they could use help from a peer raised their hands. And then finally, green light, students who figured that they understood it well enough to be able to help others. And then finally, this gave the teacher a really clear and very quick idea about where the students were at in terms of comprehending the new concepts he had taught. And that allowed him to follow up by taking a small group who needed help from the teacher, and then having students be in other groups where there were peers helping one another. Another very similar one is having students put their heads down, then raise a fist with either a thumb up, a thumb sideways, or a thumb down, again to indicate their level of understanding. So that, and again, this is a routine that you want to build in so kids know exactly what you're going for after a particular lesson. Fist to 5 is yet another way to check comprehension, more nuanced, if you will. And again, you're going to get a copy of this, so I'm not going to belabor this. And then finally, it's really it's important to encourage students to show their understandings without using English to do so. So you can encourage them to gesture, point, act out, draw, or graph their understandings. I have observed in many immersion classrooms over my lifetime, and I'm telling you, it's pretty brilliant where you walk into a classroom where the teacher has already established a classroom environment where students don't use English. They are only using that immersion language. And then it's completely different to go in another classroom where the teacher is very inconsistent where you hear from the teacher all this time, I hear English, stop using English, stop, I want to hear Spanish, I want to hear Spanish. And yet is inconsistent in that they accept English responses sometimes. So it's about the environment that you set up as well. Okay, and finally, turning to instructional scaffolding. This involves the very devices or tools embedded in instructional activities that we use to facilitate comprehension of both language and content, as well as understanding of the activity itself. So things like word walls, graphic organizers, manipulatives, labels, concept maps, and so on and so forth. Lots of multimedia sources as well. So word walls can be especially effective with younger learners, and these should be organized in some way. The example shows words alphabetically, but another way is to organize them by part of speech. On the example shown here, there doesn't appear to be any pattern to the colors used, but if I were organizing words alphabetically, I would color code the words by part of speech. Another great example that teachers are very adept at are using props to facilitate comprehension. So not the picture, but the activity came from a Spanish immersion teacher whose classroom I spent some time in. Her name is Amy Eggenberger. She's no longer a Spanish immersion teacher, was kind of sad, but she was a first grade Spanish immersion teacher. And to teach the life cycle of the butterfly using the very hungry caterpillar, she had a green oven mitt that she sewed eyes on and an antenna. And then inside that green oven mitt, she actually had a little butterfly that she wrapped around her finger with like a pipe cleaner or piece of wire. And then she had made all of these items, all the items that appear in the book, the fruits and the different things that the caterpillar eats through. She created them in felt with a big circle in the middle of each. And as she told the story, she would have the caterpillar eat through 5 oranges or eat through 6 strawberries or whatever it was. And each time she's just piling up these felt pieces onto her arm. And toward the end, when the caterpillar gets into the cocoon, although it should be a chrysalis rather than a cocoon, she got a gray sleeping bag cover. And she put her arm in this sleeping bag cover and read the story a little bit. And then she pulled her arm out of the sleeping bag cover, but pulled everything out, including the oven mitt and all of those pieces, and left those in the bag. But she has that butterfly wrapped around her finger, and she pulls out the butterfly, and this is how the caterpillar becomes the butterfly. It was just a really brilliant way of teaching that story. Another great way is concept maps that you would do with students. Concept maps can be created by the teacher or co-created with learners. And this particular example again came from Spanish immersion and was linked to an interactive activity. It was for a unit on measurement, and each student got a different card. You can see that there are different shapes and colors. So the blue rectangles depict what we measure: length, mass, volume, and temperature. The yellow circles showed the various units used for each: meters, liters, grams, degrees. And the pink triangles depicted the various tools that we use to measure: a ruler, a scale, a cup, a thermometer. So students had to mingle in the classroom to find their matches, so that each group of 3 would have a blue, a yellow, and a pink card, such that they could create an accurate sentence about measurement. So we measure mass in grams or kilograms, or the scale, for example. And once again, we can see how this activity requires both comprehension and production. I'm finding that I'm running out of time here, but I'm going to very briefly take you to a website that we created. This is for creating graphic organizers. Graphic organizers are truly brilliant scaffolds, especially for scaffolding comprehension of particular concepts, where you want students to perhaps compare 2 concepts, like with a Venn diagram, as you see here. And let's see. We created these. I'm gonna see if I can get out now and go to the website. So we created this website to have customizable graphic organizers. There are 20 on the site. We wanted teachers to be able to easily create them in the language of instruction. So you can create these in Gaelic. And we also wanted the graphic organizers to become good scaffolds, not just for demonstrating that content understanding, but also for scaffolding the language they needed to express compare and contrast, for example. As you saw in that Venn diagram, the kind of language that students are producing has nothing to do with compare and contrast. And often we use a graphic organizer as a stepping stone to having students write a paragraph comparing and contrasting, or writing sentences or whatever, but there hasn't been any scaffold for the language needed to compare and contrast. So this is the introduction that provides you with lots of information, and you would navigate using the left bar here if you wanted to go, or you can navigate from the introduction piece as well. At the overview site, when you want to see what kind of thinking skills the graphic organizer taps into, you hover your cursor over the graphic organizer, and then it tells you the thinking skills. Alternatively, if you wanted cause and effect or comparing and contrasting, you hover the cursor over that thinking skill, and it identifies the graphic organizers. It's also supposed to, yeah, it's not working, I don't know why, but it's also supposed to, when you click on the type of graphic organizer, a little model is supposed to show up, but I'm not sure why it's not working for me. At any rate, once you've selected a graphic organizer, then you go to the templates, and here you've got all of these different templates that you can work with. I'm going to go to the compare and contrast chart, and here you have the example, and we talk about the main purpose, the thinking skills that are targeted, how to use this, and then we have this whole section on language implications, and that's really intended to help teachers think through what language they want students to learn and practice for comparing and contrasting, for example. Then you click on Create Your Own, and up pops a planning sheet, and you can just change everything here to whatever you want it to be. Same with the graphic organizer itself. You just can type in here and so on. And then down here you have the target language structures, and this is just a little area where the teacher can be planning what language she or he wants students to use. And then there's a place for an additional language task, and this is an additional task that students complete after doing the graphic organizer that gets them practicing the language, okay, of compare contrast, for example. And as you are creating this teacher planning sheet, the student handout is magically being created, and then you save it and print it out. The only part that doesn't come up in the student handout is the target language structures, because that's just a place where the teachers are thinking and planning, okay? So now let me go back to my PowerPoint. And you can see here that with the help of Google Translate, I did this in Gaelic, in Scots Gaelic. And here you can see the students are supposed to compare reptiles and amphibians in terms of their physical characteristics, habitat, food, and behaviors. And then down below is this additional language task where they are to write at least 2 sentences to compare and contrast the animal groups. Write 1 sentence describing a similarity and 1 describing a difference. For example, both reptiles and amphibians are cold-blooded, and amphibians have smooth and moist skin, whereas reptiles are dry and scaly. So you give some examples there, and then the students have to do that as well. Okay, so let me just sum up here. Scaffolding comprehension then involves verbal scaffolding, including paraverbal, verbal, and nonverbal strategies. If you think back to that video, procedural scaffolding, other predictable routines, activating background knowledge, modeling, comprehension checks, and instructional scaffolding, such as the use of props and visuals and graphic organizers, etc., to scaffold both content understanding and language production.
Amazing. So I hope everybody's followed the link I posted up there to register for that session, and for it, indeed for any other sessions that are coming from the Centre for Teaching Excellence, whether it's about rural education or research or whatever it is. If you follow that link down there, that will take you to everything as it pops up. There is one question here, but I dare say it's not going to be a quick answer, and we might not have time for it this evening, but it's definitely something that is not and only a problem with yourself, Mags, that's put up this up. A class of 31 pupils, lots of English despite daily reminders. Fluent speaker in class, also reverting to English. Primary 7, so they're about 11. Most don't access Gaelic out with the class. I think this isn't quite a common problem within Gaelic, and possibly something that some of our secondary teachers might be able to research in a wee bit more depth and come up with some solutions too. Do you have any quick solutions? I'm very aware of the time and that we've already taken a lot of your time, Dee, this evening.
Yeah, I think
or this afternoon.
Some of the suggestions that I was offering earlier for staying in Gaelic, right? You know, I would. One of the things that I've also seen teachers do is that they create a classroom contract, a written contract that says, I'm committed to using Gaelic. This space is for us to use Gaelic. I'm going to use Gaelic. And the students sign it, the teacher signs it, and the parents sign it.
I was just going to say, that was my next step, was send it home.
Yeah, and
everybody
the parents sign it. And those contracts are posted in the classroom. Okay, it kind of puts a little bit more responsibility on them. You know, I would again have a very strong conversation with them about how important it is. What we know is that language acquisition will not move forward unless students are using the language. They will not get better unless they use Gaelic. They won't. They will not get better unless they use Gaelic. And talk with them about how important it is for them to be a participant in this Gaelic speaking community and being committed to saving this language that's in danger of disappearance. It's really, you know, when you talk with kids about that, I think that they can, you know, they can get on board sometimes. But, you know, also another thing to remember is that sometimes in adolescence, you know, they're just not interested. And then what you will find is that after adolescence, through all that stuff that we go through as adolescents, they're more committed when they're older, you know. So sometimes it can just be hard with adolescents, but there are some ways to try to make them responsible so that they're all in it together, if you will. Yeah.
I could be here for another hour talking about just that point on its own. I think it's fascinating, and there's lots of solutions, but I think it starts with conversation with the students. Thank you so much, Dee. This has just been like the most interesting and insightful evening or afternoon with yourself. We're so very pleased and happy that you wanted to be part of this evening. So I'll just give a wee Gaelic Hub update for anyone that's still with us in Gaelic and in English. As sin déanna fiúid in aithe acinn fáilte a chuidir teacher in fó astí, coicnid a iascí bó fiogit na dúcha bó iad na bunscola agus artscoil, agus ha sin chom máchal chom luach for a seo, chom cho insinach sa gas a ha rochbe, agus chom gwn ule a bhí go per call agus skillan Teagasg agus raimsachi a fia i chéile agus maina Gaelic. We're very excited to welcome our secondary teachers next week. We'll be inducting them next week. 5 enthusiastic and dedicated Gaelic teachers from primary and secondary from all over the country. This is an exciting time for education, and particularly Gaelic education, where we can begin to knit together class-based practice and research for the betterment of Gaelic and our young people, our young learners. Hier in Kel as den Q&A den waardig na hinnich tulik feestrig me join the session in Eile Erline ha noch gus an only check. Please check out the link that's in the Q&A and indeed sign up for future events that are available on that link. There'll be more between now. Our programme is developing, and as the more will appear shortly. He can tashbanig keld in the chleachdadh agus ceisteach an gama big who given a herking. We can go more coming and budding of minute eirson ashfall chothrom line in urrainn. Next week, these presentation slides and a link to the recording, as well as I promise a very short questionnaire will land in your inbox. We would very much like to hear from you and your feedback about this session so that we can just keep getting better and better and make it even more relevant for you. Modern time gediecht son nune agus nui. We hashin and dochus gundachart and session shorave as confession shiv ulich ik na hession ik jirig na bhios le until Roy Lister. Thank you very much again for your time and interest and for coming tonight, and not least to Dee for such a wonderful session. We hope that you can all attend Professor Roy Lister's session at the end of next month, and also thank you to Louise in the background there who's keeping us all right and making sure her technological skills makes it as successful as it has. More and time gonna hula dinne. Thank you very much, agus aiche